more about how we got here, but I think the foundation was a phrase I say often, that know what you believe and why you believe it. You're not going to be liked by everyone, but if you're clear on your values and your convictions, then you will be loved by enough people that organizations are going to want to partner with you. In my experience, organizations want predictability, they want reliability, they want integrity. And so if you have a position that you have done the work in building a platform, people are going to be responsive to that. I think with Social Current and myself, that's how we connected initially, and how we've had, I don't know how many dozens of collaborations. And what I'm most excited about is that when that fusion of preparation and opportunity meet, you see some really powerful results. I mean, we've had collaborations where we received over 10,000 retweets on a thread, over 1 million views on a TikTok or an Instagram reel, thousands of signups to a newsletter, and beyond. And so for me, it's about being consistent in my platform of advancing civil rights, racial justice, gender justice, economic justice, and finding the organizations who are values driven, who align with that. And as long as you're consistent with that, not only will you build an amazing platform of people who are like-minded and are kind of the core audience of what these organizations need, but then they also recognize your value and they invest the necessary resources to be successful in that space too.
That's awesome. And I think it's been reflected through your work, both as a creator, as a collaborator, but now as a potential future member of the House of Representatives. I'll pass it to you, Julia, if you want to tell us all a little bit about your very first creator collaboration, how it went, what you were thinking, and then we'll go to Mika last.
Yeah, so before I started working with creators, I was working with celebrities as sort of campaign surrogates, and got to see firsthand what working organically with somebody in a position of power who had influence online, how that could change conversations and drive narratives and also drive action, right? So working with creators, I saw as just another new innovative way to sort of replicate the celebrity model, but do it even better by having these people who are even more approachable and even more relatable to their audiences with perhaps even more trust. So that's always the sort of the mind frame that I'm thinking about this in. So my first creator campaign, we jumped right in with Ashwath. It all came together very quickly. And I remember really just being so impressed by the creativity of the folks who were making the content, issues that I had been thinking about for a long time and that, have been sort of talked about in the same way over and over, being applied to trending sounds or memes or interesting skits. So the biggest thing that stood out to me was just the creativity and the way that these creators were really translating this content and this information in new and digestible ways and entertaining and interesting ways to really engage key audiences. So I just remember, honestly, just being so blown away by the creativity and the quality of the content.
That's awesome. And I think working with creators gives a lot of folks a lot of ways to tap into different voices and different stories and share things that, you may not have within your organization, but you're able to through your partnership with creators. Finally, but last but not the least, Mika, if you want to talk about your very first creator collaboration and how it went and sort of what it was like.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you were talking, I was trying to think of my exact first one, and I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to talk about our first kind of campaign instead of our first individual one. But one of our first campaigns was also with Ashwath and the team at Social Current, and looking at the child tax credit. So this was when the expanded child tax credit was still active. And what we were doing is we wanted to push out a campaign that talked about the benefits of the child tax credit and really worked to engage and educate different audiences about the tax policy. And so what we had noticed is up until that point, to a large degree, a lot of the conversation around something as momentous as the expanded child tax credit was happening behind paywalls, in op-eds or on television, and not necessarily being led by the folks who are being directly impacted by the policy. And it wasn't the messaging wasn't exactly directed towards the people impacted by the policy. It was kind of that same regurgitation of the same few power players in the Beltway, and not reaching out to different communities. And so what was really exciting for us to be able to work with creators on this type of program is it allowed us to really give more creative control over to the individuals who are actually being impacted and living the day-to-day realities of the policy. And one anecdote that I'll often give is, I am a younger, somewhat millennial, up to interpretation, mixed race Asian living in DC. I am one demographic. I have been in progressive politics for a while, and I know the ins and outs of messaging, but at the end of the day, my lived experiences are still like just my own. And what we've found is like, I shouldn't necessarily be telling, say, young Black voters in Georgia or Latino voters in Arizona what most speaks to them. We should be finding ways to actually hire them and give them power on the campaigns. And creators were an amazing way to be able to do that. And it's been really exciting to learn from everyone on this call as we've been figuring out the space together.
100%. I think like one of the things I also have noticed about a lot of panels is we've talked about the power of creators, but I'd love to like touch on like what it looks like internally to get an organization to build a creator program, specifically with you, Mika, and you, Julia. Like, what does it take to like get it started? Or like, how do you, if someone has no creator program, like where do they start?
Oh man. No, it's a great question. And I know that a lot of folks are working through that right now. And I will say I'm very fortunate that Priorities USA is completely bought in and is super excited about the creator program. And I think it really is org specific, right? Of what your goals are and also what your expertise is, right? So at Priorities USA, we've been running digital paid media for a very long time. That is our expertise. That's our bread and butter. And so we think of creators as one, sort of a part of that larger paid media program, but also that creators have unique, opportunities that a traditional digital, program would not have. So we sort of see there's two main gaps in sort of digital media right now. And so the first one is platforms, which is sort of the most straightforward, is that you can't run political ads on TikTok. So working with creators is our way to be able to do that. And then the second is trust. We've seen a rapid decay in trust in our institutions and corporations and sort of the powers that be. And so being able to work with creators and have messaging come through these trusted, authentic voices instead of, some brand you don't know online, is incredibly important in filling that gap. So I think you really have to tailor sort of your pitch to the type of organization you are working with. But I think at the end of the day, what we need to see happen is that I think a lot of the times creator programs are seen as nice to haves, and we need to see them now as a necessity. If you are going to be doing a paid ad program, if you are going to be running organic social, and you have a budget, you need to be doing this point blank period. So whether you have to sell it as, filling a gap or being part of a larger program you already have going on, or if you have to look at the private sector and the billions of dollars they're spending on influencers, I think there's lots of different ways to sort of tailor making sure that creators are part of your program.
Absolutely. I want to echo, reshare everything that Julia just said. And I think, so at Community Change and Community Change Action, kind of similar to Julia, lucked out and my organization is on board and fully in it. I think when talking with other folks, and also when we started our own program at Community Change and Community Change Action, was recognizing that just because it's a new type of power, it doesn't mean that kind of the overall strategies that we know work in progressive campaigns don't apply. So Community Change has been around for over 50 years. We've been grassroots organizing for a really long time. And what was exciting was to see the same principles and values that were applied at the very beginning of our organization still applied and just taken and translated onto new platforms. And so in that way, it feels a little bit less scary. It's not like we're jumping fully into the deep end, into this new bizarre world. What we're doing is we're just continuing what we've already know works and making sure that it's actually accessible to a new audience. I think also building in trust at every layer of the organization is really important because, as much as I can say it's not that much of a new tactic, it's a continuation of what we know works. It does feel a little bit scary sometimes. You see like some of these buzzwords and it seems like, and if something is scary, then sometimes we don't want to do it or take the risk. But one of the things that I think really propelled us forward was recognizing that a lot of the jobs, a lot of the roles that exist right now on campaigns didn't exist in them like 5 or 10 years ago. And the roles that it will exist like in the next 5 or 10 years are not made yet. And what we need to be able to do is to make sure that we have a deep bench of folks in the progressive movement. And that means recruiting young, diverse talent who know their audiences, just creators, ideally building kind of that next generation of political leaders. And the last thing I will say is, and this is true across digital, we've seen this kind of again and again of folks viewing, again, a different type of power as being maybe like less intellectual or less serious, viewing kind of op-eds or like one type of language as the like higher brow language and other types of language is not. And I think that type of bias, unfortunately, I know like I have to keep reminding myself of it. It's innate as the society we live in, but remembering that just because something is on TikTok doesn't make it any less powerful, doesn't make it any less impactful, doesn't make it any less intellectual. And if everyone could make a viral TikTok tomorrow and reach millions of people, like we'd all be doing it. So kind of respecting and recognizing that power and giving kudos where it's deserved, I think is really important.
Right. And one of the things we always tell organizations is, you're working with this creator, you're trusting them. If, you had 1 million followers, you could decide what to do, but you don't. And so, sorry. But obviously not always the best way to navigate these conversations. But Kasim, you've worked with a ton of brands, you've worked with nonprofits, you've navigated a lot of these conversations on the other side of the table. Are there any best practices, learnings you have for organizations on how to communicate best with you or how to work with you, or just any general stories about what works?
I co-sign everything my esteemed colleagues said. I think they've got an extraordinarily good grasp. And so if you are an organization that wants advice, hire these 2 women and ask them to guide you because they know what they're talking about. In terms of best practices, look, I think if there's anything we're learning from the strikes happening nationwide right now is pay people what they're worth, and you will get the ROI. Every study shows that when you pay workers a living wage or more, then productivity increases, tenure increases, health insurance costs decrease, because when people have money, guess what? It helps them combat their anxiety and health issues. So one, pay people what they're worth. 2, communicate with them on a channel that they prefer. And sometimes that can be hard to figure out. I'm fortunate that I've got an excellent media agent who filters these out for me. But the reason why that needs to happen is because I will get somebody offered me an absurd amount of money to wear a thong. And I mean, look, that's just not my thing. But if you had taken 5 seconds and looked at my brand, you would have not wasted your time and embarrassment to offer me something like that, right? And so respect people where they are, right? For someone that might be the ideal thing, for others it's not. And if it's not, then you risk ruining your own brand, because if I was cynical, I could have put that company on blast and said, look, this is how just detached they are from reality. And then the third thing is really ensure that the person leading this charge understands how valuable of an ROI this actually is. I've worked with Google Ads on a lot of different organizations. And if you have worked Google Ads, you know that they can be anywhere from $1 to $50 a click. Most of us on here aren't charging $50 a click for prime access to people who care about these particular issues. I've worked with several voting rights organizations. I've actually polled my 350,000 followers on Twitter, and I got like a 96% say they vote, right? And so if you're a voting rights org, I can pretty much guarantee you we will get you a high ROI on that without spending $50 a click. And so I think, hiring the leaders like the women on this call to guide you, paying people what they're worth, and honoring them on the right values and ideas, and then making sure that you're spearheading this from a place of this is not an expense, but this is an ROI. We're spending $1 to get back $1.50. We're spending $10 to get back $20. With that mentality and then being consistent with it, you can be extraordinarily successful in this space.
Jumping in on sort of the ROI point, I think like I've had multiple conversations with all of the folks on this panel around ROI in the creator space and how it can often be different than other spaces, but also like, you know, how do you think about ROI or measurement or, you know, thinking about this work? Like, what are some things you use to communicate internally that this is working, that is not, or to communicate to stakeholders that this is working or not? And whoever wants to take that one first.
I'll just very quickly jump in and give a very short answer that I think the ROI needs to be measured both in terms of financial as well as impression count and branding as well. Sometimes you got to spend money to make money. And especially if you're trying to get the word out, you may go into the red to get the messaging out there, but the metrics can't just be, did this get me an instant return? If you're a serious organization, which I'm assuming, you know, most folks in this space are, I'm correctly assuming, then you recognize that sometimes it can take 6 months, a year, 2 years, 5 years to build a brand. And so don't just look at it in terms of, did this make me an immediate financial return? Also consider from the point of view as, did this give us impressions into a space that we just didn't have access to before? And being consistent with those metrics and helps you build year over year. But those are the two things I would think about in that space.
Plus one, I love actually talking about evaluation because I think there's so much meat in there, for lack of a better term. I think I think about it in kind of a few different verticals. One is recognizing obviously who your audience is that you're trying to show like these types of measurements to, because in the same way that messages are different based on the creator and based on who's talking, the type of data and the type of evaluation that folks are looking for might be a little bit different. And so by taking kind of a constellation approach to our program has been really helpful because it's allowed us to translate and talk about the program in a lot of different spaces. So on one is just the in-app metrics. So looking at views, impressions, comments, and also translating those and finding parallels to those in other forms of outreach. So we'll often compare like the conversations happening in comments to conversations happening on the doors and canvassing and door knocking. Another one might be looking at rapid testing and third-party testing. And so we use Grow Progress a lot, which is a third-party tool to test our videos to see exactly how they're moving our key audiences, because we can't get quite that amount of data from TikTok. I won't go off the deep end and talk too much more about like audience and what you have to be careful of there, but we found that to be extremely helpful. Also looking, you know, continuing to rely on other campaign metrics to find parallels with this type of strategy. You know, we look at how many people we're able to recruit, how long they actually want to be working with us, because ideally, or at least at Community Change, our main focus is finding folks outside of the political system or folks who haven't been invited into the political system and bringing them in ideally so we can expand that electorate. But that also might mean that there's a reason that they haven't stuck with a campaign before. And so kind of giving yourself and the creator grace in that. And then the last thing I will say, because again, I could talk for too long on this one, is something I kind of referenced earlier, is that, you know, there are a lot of ways to measure different types of campaigns. You have, again, all of these different types of quantitative numbers. But at the end of the day, what's really exciting for me and what lights my fire is, again, pulling someone into the progressive movement and giving them the power to create a role for themselves. And that type of like longer term power building, because that goes from a communication strategy to a power building one. That one's really hard to measure on the offset, but giving some, you know, I can remember my first job that I was offered within the progressive movement and the doors that opened because someone recognized skills within me. And as much as we can do that for other people, I think that's where that generational change comes in.
Yeah, I think the long-term view is incredibly important, which can be very difficult in the political space when things are very cyclical. But even within a cycle, we have seen that if you work with a creator multiple times throughout different campaigns or over a longer period of time, we have seen that performance and all of those success metrics improve generally. And that could be for a lot of reasons, right? It could be that the creator is now more comfortable with your messaging or has a better relationship. It could be that their audience is just more used to that type of content from that creator. If they're someone who doesn't normally engage in voting or politics or something like that. So I do think you can have that long-term approach even within a cycle. The other thing I'll say is, yes, the in-app metrics are very helpful. And that is sort of in a language that a lot of folks speak, right? CPMs and views and impressions and all of that. I think the big caveat there is that those numbers always need context in a lot of ways, because they are not one-to-one when comparing to paid ads or even your own organic social. So I think having context to those numbers is really important, and sort of telling the story and telling that story of, like, you know, if it's a brand new campaign creator program, this organization has never done that before. Maybe you don't have really great brand awareness. So maybe those numbers aren't what you want the first time around. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it again and you should scrap your whole creator program. These things take time. All good things take time. So I think having that investment in the long term is really, really important, and being able to tell the story behind those numbers to put them in that helpful context.
Speaking sort of at the long term, where do people start with that? Like, I think we have a lot of conversations where, like, we're talking about the long term without the short term. And so I'd love to, like, also bring in the short term into this, where, like, what do people do today, tomorrow, day after? Is that working with one creator? Is that working with 10? Like, do you have any thoughts on how you all went about it at your organizations in the short term? And what you would do if you could do it again, or what you would do if you were starting at an organization today?
Well, I mean, I think you get what you put into it, right? So it really is that simple. So as much budget and time and staff capacity that you put into a program is what you're going to get back. So I think the bigger the investment, the bigger the return on this. I would say if you're starting from scratch, as someone who has built multiple programs now, the first place you start is internally figuring out what do people want out of this. You can be really surprised at the different goals folks have for a creator program. It could be very different from what you are seeing for a program. And a lot of those different goals can be incredibly valid, right? Maybe it's for earned media. Maybe, you're trying to reach a very specific voter demographic that I hadn't even thought of. So I think it's making sure that internally you're aligned on a budget, of course, but also goals. What do we want to get out of this? And who do we want to work with to do that? And then I think from there, it's finding, these incredible creator partners who want to partner with you, who believe in the mission, who are, mission driven, and sort of going from there. And I think the other big thing is to have a sort of experiential mindset, right? To understand that, this is very new to the political world in many ways, and that we are still figuring out best practices, and best practices that were true 4 years ago may not be true now. So I think there is really an element of innovation and creativity that needs to be present in all these programs, especially if you're starting out. And just like I, mentioned with, if your ROI is not exactly what you want it to be that first time around, that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it again. And if your first program doesn't give you the success metrics that you're looking for, or that the organization is looking for, that's just an opportunity to tweak, to innovate, to try new things, and then hopefully share those learnings with the rest of the space that is also doing all of those things to figure out, what works best, not just for your organization, but for all organizations trying to do political creator work.
I can hop in briefly. Yes. And I think, like, taking that first step can be really small, and that isn't, and like, if you have a really small first step, that is totally fine. I think it's also like building out the muscle memory of, like, recruiting a creator. getting your organization used to and on board with having a creator. So picking one that's maybe not too far outside of the realm of what, folks who have power in your organization might be looking for is probably a good idea. You don't have to go all off the deep end right away. But make it relatable, make sure that folks who need to feel seen in the program at the beginning do feel seen. I think, also coming up with shared vocabulary internally, especially with digital, especially with creators and influencers. We have so many different buzzwords and terms floating around. And I have not met like 5 people who all use the words exactly the same way. So make sure that you folks are on board with that. And that kind of, that builds off exactly what Julia was talking about with shared goals. But even just defining what success looks like.
100%. On the other side of that, Kasim, when you're working with brands for the first time, is there anything different you do versus if you're working with someone again repeatedly, or like how do you sort of navigate that first one from a process standpoint as a creator?
I think expectations need to meet reality. I try to make sure I don't overpromise, underdeliver, and make sure the expectations are reflective. You'll never hear me say, I guarantee you'll get this many views, or I guarantee you'll get this many clicks. I think that's just not smart to do, unless you're Taylor Swift and you've got 100 bajillion followers and everybody knows who you are, which I am clearly not. And likewise on the organization side, expectations should be smooth. I've had folks that committed to a certain amount and then try to change it mid-contract or mid-performance, and that was a big red flag for me. Or and this may seem small, or they made just the process of getting paid so difficult and so frustrating that it's if I'm spending more time filling out paperwork every single time than I am creating content, that's a problem, and you need to have a better process for that, because by virtue we're moving very, very quickly as well. But so the first time I make sure it's almost like an interview process too, right? Where it's a two-way interview process. And for me, I've had organizations where I did one collaboration with them. And then I said, look, thanks, but no thanks. I don't really think this is going to work for next time. And it could be for any number of reasons. Maybe the delivery wasn't what I thought it was supposed to be, or the fee wasn't what we had agreed to, or just their process made it so difficult that I'm like, I don't have. There's one organization, there's a very good organization. I won't mention them out of respect. That's just not my style to bash somebody publicly, but a really good organization, really good people, but their processes were so broken that creating the content took 8, 9 revisions. And by the 7th or 8th one, or actually by the 3rd one, I said, this is ridiculous. I can't keep doing this, but it kept going and going and going because they didn't know what they wanted. And so I would create something according to my values in their platform, and they didn't like it. And so we went back and forth. On the flip side, there are several organizations that I've built long-standing relationships with. In fact, just one I'm in contract negotiations with right now, because another organization, a similar competitor, wanted to bring me aboard. And this organization, because I've built trust with them, I rarely do this, but on a verbal agreement, I'm going to stick with the current organization I'm with. 1, because our values are aligned. 2, they're reciprocating their values by paying me a fair rate. And to be clear, it's not as good as what the competitor is offering. But because I've built a relationship with them, because I trust them, because they've treated me with respect, and we've built that sweat equity, and they were the first to reach out to me, and I respect that. My view is I'm reciprocating that by saying, hey, you've met me halfway. We're good. We'll get it in writing later on, but the verbal is enough. So it's just like any relationship, right? The first time you date somebody, you're cautiously optimistic, but you look for red flags. And then, after the 10th or 11th date, minor things you don't care about because the major things are taken care of. And that's kind of where this relationship works. It's like a healthy dating relationship before you get married. So
I love the sort of minor versus major analogy, because I think like a lot of times, like if you start by getting all the details right and make sure the big ones are fine, the small ones can fix themselves. But like if you get everything wrong all the time, then like no one can help you. Maybe this family can, but I think before you start a creator program, it's sort of important to have the right processes in place. Which brings me to my next question. What processes should we have in place And sort of like also like who are the different stakeholders you're talking to internally for Mika and Julia, and then for you, Qasim, like external, like who are you talking to get all of this done? Are you doing it alone? Do you have an agent? Like, are you talking to finance? Like, talk to us about like the different stakeholders and the processes involved.
I can kick this one off. For us, I am fortunate that Community Change is a very large organization with many talented people who wear different hats. And the challenge with that type of setup is also that you have to make sure that folks, you have to work together. You have to be collaborative. You have to talk with each other and build those relationships internally just as much as externally, because it is, again, that kind of like new folks hear TikTok, they hear creatives and it's like, oh, that's new, it's different. And so building that trust. For us, we have a relatively direct reporting structure in terms of like at each level or at each part in building out the creator programming. We have different folks who know that they need to have sign off on it or have eyes on it. And we also make sure that's all written down, especially when things get hectic, being able to just go back and rely on it and be like, oh yeah, I did send that video over. Okay, I should go in and double check on that. But having a lot of like, I call it like tracker discipline, all of the trackers, and then having one clear area where the reporting around the campaign comes out. So as simple as using Google Docs and Google and Dex. But yeah, tracker discipline and bugging folks, making sure they get eyes on it.
Bugging folks is a skill. It is very important in this work. I would say that one of the reasons I love doing this work is because of how cross-collaborative it is. And I think a lot of people would be really surprised by how cross-functional this work is in these types of programs. I'm in pretty much constant contact with our legal team, paid media team, development team, creative team. Even though, you know, a lot of times you only have 1 or 2 staffers working directly with creators, those 1 or 2 folks is talking to everybody. And then I think in terms of like, you know, approvers, that's something you also need to identify pretty early on, and approving at what different stages, right? So the way I think about it is, you know, there's the stage where you are thinking about the campaign, the budget you have, what you want to accomplish, right? And then how creators, you know, sort of fit into that. And then there's a stage of approving what creators you want to work with. You know, who's going to be part of this? Who are you going to sign a contract with? You know, who has to decide what creators you're working with? And then the next one is, well, what are we going to tell creators to say? What does the messaging brief look like? What are the messaging directives? What are the do's and don'ts? Sort of approving that. And then, of course, lastly, it's going to be approving the actual pieces of content. And so I always like to remind folks that we are not approving on whether you like the video or not, or whether you get it. The approval is, you know, is the messaging accurate? Are we within, you know, the legal requirements for the funding of this video? So much more of the technical side of it than if someone gets the meme or not, right? But I do think it is really more steps than folks would think. The way I think about it is it's about a 10-step process for every campaign. So you need to sort of identify who the stakeholders are at each level, and maybe it's the same, or maybe, you know, it's a funnel. But there definitely are lots of folks involved, which is why I love it, but can be a challenge for sure.
Yeah, I don't need to add anything to that. I'll tell a little story. Like when I was a kid, there was this game called Ants, where every ant would only move in like one direction, or like they'd make a right turn and that's it, and then go back. And you had to go through a maze and get the food from one end of the ant maze to the other end. And this is kind of the way I think about that, right? And Julia already described it so perfectly, and I mean, both my colleagues did, is just make sure who's responsible for what part and make sure it gets done. There's no small task here. From my point of view, I appreciate immensely when an organization already has clarity on what the briefing is, what the goal is, meaning like the deliverable, so I know what I'm being measured up against, what the fee is, the timeline, and then the process to get all that paid. When all that stuff is upfront and it's just a matter of me being able to read the brief and say yes or no, that's when I know it's a serious organization. I shouldn't need to pontificate on what is the fee or what is the timeline or where am I posting this or who the audience is. All that stuff needs to be contemplated ahead of time. In the event you want the creator to be part of that process, then the fee should be reflective of that. Don't come to me, just to be blunt, and offer me a fee that requires simple creation when you also want me to spend hours on understanding the audience and figuring that out, right? Pay the creator for that as well. But the best way I can put it is, when I get, and this is why I love working with Ashwath on this, because when I get something from him, I know he's already vetted and contemplated whether it's something that aligns with me or not, so I don't have to waste time on that. And I can read the brief and simply give a yes or no. And that saves me time, it saves them time, it saves you time as well, because the last thing you want is a creator who's pontificating for a week when you have an urgent deadline. So that's more the qualitative, but the really smart intellectual stuff, my colleagues already explained really well. So listen to them on this.
You touched on this a little bit, and we all touch on this, but I think like one of the things I've appreciated in working with you all has been speed. I think like all of these processes, if you're spending like a week on everything, that's like 2.5 months. And so like when we talk about speed, like how do you sort of see that play in, or like do you see the importance of speed in working with creators, and how do you like do this fast? Like how do you respond, and why is it important? And then while folks are answering that, if anyone has questions, please drop them in the chat. I know we're running slow on time.
I think speed is a skill, and it's something that is developed over time by working through all of these processes we've discussed. I think working with creators in a rapid response capacity, especially in politics, is incredibly effective. And it's something I hope a lot of organizations do more of the next cycle or this cycle. But that is something that needs to be refined over time. And it's something that requires an incredible amount of trust, which we've talked about a lot, or trust within the organization, and trust that creators can, get the message out, the accurate message in a timely fashion. So I would say speed is great, but speed is really a product of refining those processes and building a lot of that trust. I would also say that these things can take longer than lots of folks think about, right? It takes a lot longer than uploading an ad. It takes a lot longer than someone internally posting something on your own channels. So I think it's a good reminder to say, we're working with people, not products, not platforms. And all of those steps that I mentioned require a lot of different people to be involved. So I always like to add some good old buffer time in between all of those steps, because it can, be delayed by the humanness of it all, right? Someone didn't check an email, somebody's out sick, somebody couldn't film that day, somebody couldn't approve that day. So I think speed is great, but I would also say that speed is not always present, and that we do need to be strategic enough to build processes where we are giving ourselves enough time, and to be frank with the people that we work with that, even though having a bunch of creators respond to something in the moment would be really awesome, if we don't have the infrastructure to do it, that's just something we should be building towards. Or when folks are thinking about, a campaign launch and want creators to be brought into that, it can't be a last second thing. Oh, by the way, we have some leftover budget, would love to do this. The creator piece of it has to be brought in from day one of any sort of campaign, so that we have ample time to do all of those many steps.
Yeah, plus one again. I think getting folks setting expectations at the beginning. I think a lot of, I love it when folks want to be involved in the process, in the creative process. And I think setting up like, we're going to get this video and I'm going to need your eyes on it in the next 10 hours, or else it's going out the door. And if you are on board with that, heck yes. But if not, then what are ways that we can figure out a way around it? So, we have messaging briefs that we get, full sign off on, obviously, before kind of moving forward. But that way, if a video doesn't stray from the messaging brief, then not everyone has to see the video before it goes out. So really thinking creatively about how you're using your time, and whose time and what cooks you need in the kitchen at what point. And also knowing that for every hour that you delay, potentially that trend is no longer relevant. That idea is no longer relevant. And then having at least 2 folks for me at kind of almost each level, so that if one is sick, if one is just in a meeting, I can very politely bug the other one.
Yeah, and I'll just say, look at speed in terms of money, because time is money. And I'll give you two examples. I had one nonprofit ask me to help them fundraise for a disaster relief, and they were extremely fast, and got me the brief. It was clear. There was a clear call to action and what we needed to do. And I think because we were one of the first to start responding to this natural disaster that occurred. And by the way, this is a reputable organization, so that they had that going for them. But in terms of getting in front of eyeballs, because we were quick to put together a comprehensive message, and they knew what they believed and why they believed it, we were able to raise something like $300,000 in the first 2 weeks. Right, it was a pretty significant amount. It was more than they'd raised in the last 2 months across all channels, just from a couple of videos. On the flip side, I had another organization that reached out to me and said, we want your support. And it took them 2 weeks to get me what they needed me to talk about. And we raised something like, $4,000, which I don't think they were happy with, because they were, obviously hoping to raise a lot more. And so 300,000 versus 4,000, right? And so that it goes back to a comment I made earlier, that when preparation meets opportunity. And so a lot of it is make sure you're prepared, so that when the opportunity does arise, then you can work with speed, work with a sense of urgency, and not have to worry about, are we dotting our I's and crossing our T's? Because they've already been dotted and crossed. It's just a matter of deploying it. So it really is an excellent way to increase legitimacy, familiarity, trust, and then, of course, revenue for your stated costs.
Awesome. I don't see any questions, so we're just going to do like last minutes of advice. You can make it general, you can make it internal, you can make it unrelated to working with creators, but like, what advice do you have for folks listening, watching, reading later on?
I think breaking down all of the work that goes on the creatives, two folks in your organization or external stakeholders, breaking down exactly all of the work and labor that goes into each video. I think sometimes folks see, oh, we're paying X amount of money for a video that's less than a minute. And the answer is yes. And because what goes into that is you're paying for the actor, you're paying for this, speaking about these unions again, you're paying for the actor, the script writer, you're paying for the distribution. It takes so much energy and capacity to keep a lot of these profiles and a lot of these platforms like as highly engaging as they are, so that your video will be the one that kind of goes viral on them. And not discounting all of that labor. And if it's helpful, you can do a kind of a little bit of a cross comparison of look at other types of ads and see how much you're spending on each level, and maybe challenge yourself. I know I have to challenge myself often to think about, like, are we okay signing off on like X amount of budget for someone who looks like me, or like someone in power who has like the unpaid internship lines on their resume, who has years of experience in the Beltway because of different like life opportunities? And are we being okay with that? But are we like means testing somehow someone who doesn't look like that and someone who doesn't look like traditional power? And just keeping that in mind at every step.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll call back to sort of our how do you get buy-in question, which is I think that, in addition to looking at the private sector and the billions of dollars we're spending there, and how all of those corporations are allotting 30 to 50% of their marketing budget just to creators, right? I think on top of that, if you want to think about it in a political sense, working with creators is yet another tactic to meet voters where they are, right? That has been the tagline. We are meeting people where they are, and creators is another way to do that. Just like if you had, a community event in a battleground district, or, you were running an Instagram ad, you're meeting people where they are. Creators is another way to do that with a trusted messenger. And again, I think it's a non-negotiable part of strategy at this point. And if anyone else has questions, send them to me. I'll convince them.
Well, this has just been an amazing session. Thank you all. And we hit the stream on LinkedIn as well, so folks will be able to watch this in many places at once, and we'll recut it into some TikToks and Reels and give it to some creators. And I I won't be sharing it on Twitter though. If you're a creator and you're there, that's fine. But I left. Anyways, thank you so much. This has been an awesome session. Just really appreciate all of the insights that you all are sharing on both sides of it. I think that's just a really healthy way to, to wrap your heads around that, and also a reminder of how many systems organizations need to rethink, and it's another new system, and maybe a good time to reevaluate the ones that aren't working. So some folks are saying thanks in different locations, and to say thanks again, and hopefully we can all chat again soon, and keep an eye on the content that everyone's producing.
Thank you.